It was a Wednesday morning at 8:42 a.m. when Daniel Carter, age 39, steered his car into the parking lot of the Somerset Municipal Courthouse in Alabama. Normally, Daniel prided himself on arriving at least 15 minutes early, but today, he was cutting it close. The early morning heat draped everything in shimmering waves, and Daniel inhaled deeply, straightening his tie. His task seemed simple enough, resolving a dispute over a sudden, inexplicable property tax increase on the home left to him by his grandmother. Yet the place wasn't just a piece of real estate. To Daniel, it was Grandma's house, where a firm but loving woman had raised him, instilling discipline and a respect for the law. After her passing, Daniel held on to the home as a link to the warmth of his childhood. So when the city suddenly boosted the property tax by 30% with no clear explanation, he spent weeks compiling all the documentation to prove there had been a mistake. Though Daniel, a federal prosecutor from the Northern District of Alabama, wore a sharp navy suit and a crisp white shirt, a sense of unease knotted his stomach. Earlier that morning, he'd received a frantic phone call about a human trafficking case he was prosecuting. The defense had filed an urgent motion. Before leaving for Somerset, Daniel had to review the motion and send his quick feedback to his team, leaving him practically no time to spare for this municipal hearing, scheduled for 9 a.m. As he climbed the courthouse steps, his phone vibrated with a text from his assistant. "The judge here in Somerset is notoriously tough on latecomers. Be careful." Slipping his phone into his briefcase, Daniel reassured himself that as long as he had solid proof, a few minutes' delay wouldn't be catastrophic. Once inside, he immediately noted how different this local courthouse was from the federal ones he frequented. Beige walls with visible scuffs, worn-out wooden benches, fluorescent lighting that flickered slightly, and the faint smell of stale coffee and dusty paper gave the place a tired yet busy atmosphere. Folks clutched papers related to traffic tickets, small disputes, or minor claims, their faces showing a hint of worry or resigned fatigue. A glance at his watch showed 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes left. Striding quickly down a narrow corridor filled with hushed conversations, Daniel followed the signs to Courtroom 204, Judge Gregory Wallace. Along the way, he passed people arguing in low voices, others hugging folders protectively. This was municipal justice, less polished and more crowded than the grand federal courthouses he was used to. Outside room 204, a small brass plaque read Judge Gregory Wallace. Daniel straightened his tie once more, exhaling to steady himself. Colleagues had warned him about Wallace's reputation for strict timekeeping. Still, Daniel believed that prepared evidence would overshadow the minor tardiness. Entering, he found the room more crowded than he'd expected. Rows of anxious-looking people, an undercurrent of murmuring in the stale air. He took a seat in the back row, flipping through the property tax documents, photos of the house, prior assessment records, and comparative tax data from previous years. With each page, he mentally rehearsed his arguments. A sudden hush fell over the room. Daniel looked up as Judge Wallace, tall, silver-haired, and with a stern gaze, entered. He didn't need to speak. The bailiff's quick command, "All rise," was enough to bring everyone to their feet. Wallace settled into his chair, giving a nod that signaled them to sit. Case after case, Wallace proceeded with brisk efficiency. No warmth, no wasted words. Daniel noticed a suited man slip in 5 minutes late, seating himself near the back, and shortly after, a young woman in a hoodie and ripped jeans also quietly entered. Neither drew even a passing glance from the judge. Daniel made a mental note but focused on his own papers. It was about 9:15 a.m. when Daniel finally heard his name called. Snapping his folder shut, he strode to the front. The moment he approached, he felt a chill. Wallace's cool, penetrating stare locked onto him like a target, turning the already tense room utterly silent. "You're late, Mr. Carter," Judge Wallace announced, his voice cutting through the hush. "Do you think this court's schedule is less important than yours?" Daniel lifted his hand slightly, intending to offer an apology. "Your Honor, I apologize for any delay. I'm a federal prosecutor and had to handle an urgent—" Before he could explain, Wallace interrupted sharply. "Stop. This court operates on punctuality. I won't accept excuses." His tone held an imposing finality. Daniel inhaled slowly, conscious of dozens of eyes on him. Choosing his words carefully, he said, "I understand the importance of being on time, Your Honor. I came to address a property tax error." Wallace waved him off. "We'll get to that. First, I'm imposing a fine for contempt, $750. The shock rippled across the courtroom, a few whispers breaking out. For arriving a handful of minutes late, $750 was alarmingly steep. "Your Honor, I'd like to—" Daniel began, but Wallace slammed his gavel. "Enough. That ends here." Returning to his seat, Daniel's mind reeled. Not only was this punishment unusually harsh, but he also recalled how two others had arrived late, unscathed. A sense of familiarity crept over him. This looked like bias. Determined not to let it slide, he pulled out a notepad, quickly jotting down notes on every detail of the incident. He'd sort out the property tax matter, but first he needed to record the disparity he'd witnessed. In the meantime, Wallace continued calling cases as though nothing had happened. Daniel paid close attention. A few people cast sympathetic or curious glances his way, but most remained absorbed in their own worries. 10 minutes later, the judge summoned him again. Standing up, Daniel approached with professional composure. "Mr. Carter," Wallace said coolly, "I believe you have something about a property tax dispute?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied, exhaling a measured breath. "I've brought evidence of a 30% hike with no prior notice. The house has been in my family for decades and the tax assessments have been consistent until now." Opening his folder, he laid out photos, previous statements, and the questionable new figure. The judge reclined as though bored. "I'll review it. But do note, being a federal prosecutor doesn't give you the right to waltz in here late and disrupt our schedule." Daniel maintained a polite tone. "I understand, Your Honor. My delay resulted from an urgent human trafficking case, time-sensitive." Wallace's lips tightened. "I'm unimpressed by such justifications. Court rules apply equally, no special exceptions." Ironically, Daniel thought, equally. Yet I was the only one singled out for being late. He resisted the urge to point out the other two latecomers who'd been overlooked entirely. Still, Daniel calmly placed his tax documents on the podium. "I trust you'll handle this matter fairly, Your Honor, for everyone." Silence followed. A few murmurs passed among spectators, some nodding agreement. The judge, however, raised his gavel. "I won't have my integrity questioned. That fine stands." With a respectful nod, Daniel said, "Thank you, Your Honor." He headed back to his seat, already formulating a plan. As the morning session ended, Daniel stayed put, observing the people trickling out. Tension lingered in the air, as though many sensed the injustice but feared speaking up. He noticed a young law student with a backpack scribbling furiously, glancing at Daniel with a mix of sympathy and excitement. Outside, the Alabama heat still pressed down, and Daniel paused at the courthouse steps, phone in hand. He considered calling his assistant, but muttered, "Not yet," slipping the device away. He needed to detail everything first, compile a coherent report for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Returning to his car, Daniel found himself staring at his federal prosecutor's badge and his briefcase. Over a decade spent upholding the law, and he wasn't about to let this incident pass unchallenged. Making up his mind, he marched back inside. The courtroom was nearly empty. Judge Wallace was tidying papers, looking visibly drained. Approaching the bench, Daniel held out his badge and identification. The court clerk froze mid-typing. "Mr. Carter," Wallace said, frowning. "The session is over." "What are you doing?" Daniel offered a measured smile. "Your Honor, please allow me to introduce myself more formally. I'm Daniel Carter, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. I handle federal cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. Wallace stiffened, the color draining from his face. A few onlookers who remained leaned in, captivated. I was late today, Daniel continued, due to pressing federal work. Yet I noticed how differently your courtroom treated certain other late arrivals, especially considering racial aspects. Wallace's voice wavered slightly. If you believe there was a procedural oversight, file a complaint. This isn't the time for debate. Daniel lifted his notebook. I've already begun documenting everything, my own experience and the disparity shown to others who arrived late. As a federal prosecutor, I'm obliged to report any sign of bias or discrimination. The judge's shoulders tensed. Are you accusing this court of misconduct? I'm relaying my observations, Your Honor, Daniel answered evenly. My career is dedicated to impartial justice. Today's events raise serious questions. A heavy silence filled the room. The clerk cast anxious glances. The law student in the corner was still furiously taking notes. Wallace cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. This court takes such allegations seriously. If you think I erred, follow the proper channels. Daniel set his badge on the podium. I will, Your Honor, but I also see this as an opportunity for reflection, ensuring fairness for everyone who steps in here. Wallace's knuckles whitened on the arms of his chair. You can leave now, Mr. Carter. Daniel picked up his credentials. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be pursuing this matter thoroughly. As he walked out, he sensed the collective gaze on him. This confrontation was more than just a personal dispute. It felt like a spark igniting a broader issue. In the corridor, he typed a lengthy email to his office documenting the entire episode. Hitting send, he knew a new chapter had begun. Sure enough, the email traveled quickly. By the following morning, Janet Wilson, his supervisor, called in a rush. Daniel, I read your report. If this is accurate, we've got more than a one-off incident. Could be systemic bias. Daniel confirmed. I'm certain. What I saw wasn't subtle, and I doubt I'm alone in experiencing it. Janet sighed. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. We must handle it carefully but thoroughly. Keep collecting evidence. If the media catches wind, we need to be ready. Daniel spent hours reconstructing the prior day's court session. Searching public records of Judge Wallace's rulings, he identified a pattern. Black defendants faced higher fines and harsher treatment, while white defendants often received reduced penalties or casual warnings. He spoke with local attorneys who shared their own stories, some timid, others outraged, corroborating the same bias. Not long after, the Judicial Review Commission formally launched an investigation. They demanded years' worth of case files, interviewing staff members. Miss Jenkins, the court clerk, shakily handed over a small notebook. I recorded everything suspicious over the years. I was terrified to speak up. They also met Martin Cooper, the longtime bailiff. I've seen him treat people differently for over a decade, he said quietly. I always knew it was wrong. News of Daniel's showdown with Wallace spread. A law student present that morning posted a detailed account on social media, going viral. Local headlines read, Suspected bias in Somerset courts. Federal prosecutor confronts judge. Reporters bombarded Daniel with interview requests, but he stayed focused on the investigation. Pressure on Wallace escalated. He was summoned to closed-door meetings with judicial oversight boards. Publicly denying any misconduct, he grew increasingly cornered by mounting evidence. Within a week, Janet's voice crackled over the phone again. Preliminary findings are staggering. Data shows black defendants are 3 times as likely to be fined as white defendants for identical offenses. It's systemic. Daniel asked, What's next? She replied, We're taking it up with the state judicial board. Daniel, the media won't drop this. Be prepared. Though tired, Daniel felt no inclination to retreat. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. The story mushroomed beyond Somerset. National outlets picked it up, amplifying hashtags like equal justice and no more bias. People nationwide shared similar experiences, alleging prejudice in their local courts. Daniel pressed on with the Judicial Review Commission, piecing together records. The portrait of injustice grew clearer. For 5 years, Wallace disproportionately penalized black defendants. White offenders were far more often let off with minimal scrutiny. Testimonies poured in, some anonymous, some public, detailing unfair penalties and demeaning treatment. Local activist groups marched outside the courthouse under banners proclaiming justice must be fair. Insiders at the courthouse who had once endured Wallace's behavior now felt emboldened. Ms. Jenkins was hailed as a key witness, her meticulous notes reinforcing the official statistics. Martin Cooper, the bailiff, also stepped forward. "I've watched this too long. I'm relieved it's finally being exposed." Wallace's isolation grew. Initially dismissing the accusations as misunderstandings, he couldn't escape the evidence. A brief public statement offered regret for any unintentional harm. But it rang hollow. Meanwhile, Daniel kept fulfilling his federal duties. Letters and calls flowed in, some praising, others pleading for help. A retired attorney from another state wrote, "I've seen injustice like you're describing, but never had the nerve to speak up. Thank you for doing what many of us couldn't." Gradually, scrutiny extended to other courthouses throughout Alabama. Journalists dug deeper, and the State Judicial Oversight Committee ordered a large-scale review of municipal courts, pledging to fight systemic prejudice. By month's end, the commission released an initial report condemning Judge Wallace's systematic bias. Facing potential disciplinary action, Wallace chose to resign, stating tersely, "Stepping aside is in the best interest of our community." Some saw it as an admission of guilt. For Daniel, it validated his stand but marked only the beginning. Real reform was needed. He was invited to speak at law schools and community gatherings on unveiling courtroom bias, becoming an inspiration to younger lawyers committed to changing a flawed system. In one talk, a black law student approached, eyes gleaming. "Your story shows me law is more than rules. It's about people. I want to follow your example." Daniel smiled, replying, "We need voices like yours. The fight is just getting started." 3 months after that fateful morning, Somerset's courthouse underwent a makeover. Walls were repainted, signage offered instructions in multiple languages, directing people to payment plans and legal aid. A modest plaque by the entrance read, "Justice belongs to everyone." Inside, the changes ran deeper. Wallace was gone, replaced by a younger judge known for integrity. Personnel underwent mandatory anti-bias training. Fines and sentence records were closely audited and regularly released for transparency. Daniel stood at the back of a freshly renovated courtroom, about to address local judges and attorneys. Their expressions were expectant, even grateful. A warm surge of pride and caution swept through him. Progress had started, though obstacles lay ahead.